Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the biological perspective and giving you some context about what this chapter is all about. Neuroscience is a branch of the life sciences that deals with the structure and function of neurons, nerves, and tissue that make up the nervous system. So biological psychology, or biopsychology, is a branch of neuroscience that focuses on the biological basis of psychological processes, behavior, and learning. So in a nutshell, biopsychology is how your biology can influence your behavior. So I have a question for you. Have you ever heard the phrase nature versus nurture, or is it nature or nurture? And oftentimes this is in the context of a specific trait or behavior, like is aggression caused by nature or nurture? Well, nature refers to an individual's genes, their biology, and nurture refers to any socializing agent that an individual is exposed to, like your family or your culture or your country, etc. And essentially, if you ever hear this question, you should immediately now think this is flawed. This is not the way to think about this at all, because it's not nature or nurture. It's always a combination of both. It's nature and nurture, because these are always interacting. Your biology is always interacting with your environment. So a concrete example of this would be, perhaps I could have the genes to be 6'5", and be a pretty tall individual, but if I grow up in an environment where I have poor nutrition and not very much food, I may only grow to be 5'11". So I have the genes to be that tall, but because I don't have the food, which would be the environment, I wouldn't actually grow to be that tall. So the bottom line is that it's always going to be an interaction between nature and nurture. And actually, it's even a little bit more complex, because you also have to fold in an individual's own personal choices. So when we talk about the origins of behavior, we have to look at it from a three-pronged perspective: your genes, or your biology, your environment, again, the socializing agents, and your individual choices. So those are all interacting ultimately to influence your behavior and your actions. So what we're here to do in this chapter is to examine the biological perspective. So let's ask this question here: how can biology influence behavior? In broad brushstrokes, biology can influence behavior in a number of different ways. Of course, your genes can influence a wide range of your traits and characteristics. Your brain structure, the way your brain is organized, can influence your behavior. Neuronal and neurotransmitter functioning, which we're going to talk about in the second part of this lecture, and then also hormones can definitely influence your behavior as well. So we're going to talk specifically in this part about how your brain structure can influence behavior, and we're going to look at an area of the brain called Broca's area. So this is an area in the left frontal lobe that is responsible for aspects of speech production. So you can see it there. And then also there's Wernicke's area, which is responsible for comprehension of language, and then also some aspects of speech production. So when you hear someone talk, what happens is the sound hits your ear, it goes up into Wernicke's area, then into Broca's area. So let's say that you want to respond to this person, and then in Broca's area various processes happen that allow you to produce speech. And after speech production happens in Broca's area, neurons are activated in the motor cortex to allow you to actually move the muscles that you need to move, like your lips and your jaw and your tongue, to be able to produce this speech. So let's look at this area, Broca's area, in a little bit more detail. And we're going to look at a study here that's really, really interesting, called the sequential processing of lexical, grammatical, and phonological information within Broca's area. Lexical refers to anything that has to do with language comprehension, and phonological has to do with anything related to speech production. So Sahin and colleagues in 2009 wanted to know if there were separate areas within Broca's area that were responsible for aspects of language production. So what they did is they implanted electrodes in 3 populations, which means like clusters of neurons in Broca's area. So what they do is they anesthetize the scalp and then actually drill through the skull, and they're able to implant these really tiny electrodes into the brain and measure the activity of very specific regions of the brain. So they implanted a number of electrodes in Broca's area, and they measured the temporal sequence, which means the timing of the neuronal activity while the participants did several tasks, including reading words. So the participants would just see a word on the screen, and they would be instructed to just read it, and that's all. In other conditions, they would be instructed to read the word and then also change the word tense, like talk to talked, or change the word number, like rock to rocks. And they would just do this in their heads. They wouldn't actually speak it. And then in another condition, they would read the word, change the word, and then also speak the word. So what they found was that there were actually 3 clusters of neurons that were responsible for those 3 sequences of actions. There was a cluster of neurons responsible for comprehending words, which happened at about 200 milliseconds after the participants saw the word on the screen. After that, there was a cluster of neurons that was responsible for changing the grammar. So when the participants were asked to change the word from talk to talked, what they found is that this second cluster of neurons became highly activated when they actually had to make those grammatical inflections. And then there was another cluster of neurons responsible for speaking the words. So when the participants were asked to change the grammar and then also speak the words, this third cluster of neurons became activated for getting the processes started to produce that speech. And what they found was that this happened in a sequence. First you had comprehension, so those neurons were activated, then the neurons for changing the grammar, and then the neurons for actually speaking. So an interesting question would be, well, what happens if this part of the brain becomes damaged? And when that happens, people suffer from something called Broca's aphasia, which is when people who suffer impaired language production, speech production, as a result of brain damage. And most of that damage happens in Broca's area. So what does that damage look like? Well, when people with Broca's aphasia speak, they omit most pronouns, prepositions, conjunctions, auxiliary helping verbs, quantifiers, and tense and number endings. So what does that look like? Well, here's an actual paragraph with those aspects of language omitted. And let's just read through it to see what this would sound like. 1861, French surgeon Paul Broca treat gangrene patient, been mute 30 years. Man died 5 day later. Broca did autopsy, found lesion left frontal cortex. Next few year, Broca examine, brain addition, patient aphasia, language impairment. Nearly all case he found damage that included, oops, shouldn't have said that, included same area, is now known Broca's area. Usual cause was stroke, interruption, blood flow to part of brain. So also the reason why this part of the brain tends to become damaged is for most people that happens as a result of a stroke, where there is a lack of blood flow to that part of the brain and hence a lack of oxygen, and so the cells in that part of the brain will die. So the take-home message here is that there is a direct link between the brain and behavior, and you can clearly see how damage to areas in the brain can lead to highly specific and also major behavioral changes. So if you want to actually see an example of this, check out the video under modules titled Video Wernicke's and Broca's Aphasia.